My name is Elena Parker. I'm 29, and I live alone in a tiny apartment on the east side of Portland, Oregon. After a full year of silence, I finally stepped back into my parents' house for Thanksgiving, telling myself I was ready to face whatever awkwardness waited. But the moment I walked in, the whole room shifted. Thanksgiving was supposed to feel warm and familiar, yet every eye at the table followed me like I'd interrupted something sacred. My sister, Camilla, stood beside her new boyfriend, clinging to his arm as if she needed everyone to see she'd won some unspoken competition. He smiled politely and asked what I did for work, and I barely got a single syllable out before my mother cut me off with a sharp, "Don't embarrass us." The table burst into laughter. Camilla leaned in with a sugar-sweet smirk and added, "Maybe lie this time, so you don't sound so pathetic." I didn't argue. I just smiled soft, calm. The kind of smile that made a few people blink in confusion. Because they had no idea I was no longer the Elena they remembered, the one they could laugh into silence. And before we go any further, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd really love to know how far this story is traveling. Growing up, it didn't take long for me to understand my place in the Parker family hierarchy. Even as little kids, Camilla was the one everyone admired: bright smile, perfect curls, the kind of child adults loved to show off. She was the golden child, the center of every camera, every story, every proud announcement at church or school. Meanwhile, I was quiet. I loved books, spent afternoons sketching in the corner of my room, and preferred listening to people rather than talking over them. For some parents, that might have been endearing. For mine, it was a flaw, something that made them apologize with their eyes when friends asked, "And this is your other daughter?" They called me shy, awkward, a little odd, as if those labels explained why they rarely bragged about me the way they did about Camilla. We lived in Lake Oswego, one of those pristine suburbs outside Portland, where lawns are perfectly cut, kids go to soccer practice in matching jerseys, and families compete quietly but intensely over who looks more perfect from the outside. In a place like that, image was everything. My parents were experts at curating it. Camilla fit the picture beautifully, outgoing, bubbly, always ready to pose. I, on the other hand, didn't. And in Lake Oswego, not fitting the picture came with a price. My accomplishments, my art awards, my essays praised by teachers, my perfect attendance never made it to the family fridge. If I brought home an A, my dad would say, "Good. But your sister got an A+ last year." If Camilla brought home a B, my parents would cheer like she'd saved the world. The message was clear: her smallest achievement was a victory. My biggest achievement was just expected. Or worse, unnoticed. By middle school, the comparison became so constant that I learned to shrink myself to make things easier. When relatives visited for the holidays, Camilla performed her usual talent shows, singing, dancing, making everyone laugh, and I sat quietly on the stairs, watching her shine. If an aunt asked what I was interested in, Mom would answer for me, "Oh, she's into her weird drawing things." Even her tone made the room chuckle. I laughed with them sometimes, pretending it didn't sting. But every joke carved something into me, something that would take years to undo. High school made everything worse. Camilla bloomed socially: cheerleading, homecoming courts, boys lining up for her attention. Our parents adored it. They lived through her popularity like it validated them as parents. She brought friends home constantly, loud girls with perfect hair and perfect confidence, the kind of girls who walked past me as if I were the houseplant in the corner. Mom would tell me to stay out of the way when Camilla hosted, because teenagers want their space. But really, I think she didn't want Camilla's friends asking who the quiet, weird sister was. Sometimes I wondered if she hoped they'd forget I existed. The strange part is that I didn't hate Camilla. She wasn't outright cruel during those years. She was simply raised to believe the world revolved around her. When the whole family treats you like the sun, you grow up believing everyone else is just orbiting. She didn't see the way our parents dismissed me. Why would she? No one ever taught her to look. Instead of fighting for attention, I found comfort in the arts. I'd sit under the maple tree in our backyard with my sketchbook, drawing everything that made sense to me when the house didn't: the quiet sidewalk, the neighbor's cat, the shapes of clouds, even the chipped paint on our back fence. I drew to feel like I mattered somewhere, even if that somewhere was just blank paper. But favoritism has a way of echoing through the years. In 10th grade, when I won a regional art competition, I remember coming home with the certificate trembling in my hand. I actually rehearsed what I'd say to Mom, how proud she would be. How maybe this time she'd want to put my work on the fridge next to all the photos of Camilla. But instead, Dad barely looked up from his laptop and said, "Art is nice, honey, but it's not going to pay the bills." Mom didn't even ask to see it. The certificate sat on the kitchen counter until it was stained with coffee and eventually thrown away. That was the moment I stopped trying to impress them. From then on, every success felt private, not because I wanted it to be, but because sharing it always ended the same way: minimized, mocked, or ignored. Every small mistake, however, was amplified. If I forgot to unload the dishwasher, Mom sighed dramatically and said, "Camilla would never do that." If I came home a minute late, Dad lectured me about responsibility, even though Camilla regularly stayed out till midnight without consequence. Slowly, unknowingly, I became invisible. Not because I wasn't there, but because they chose not to see me. I grew used to walking behind Camilla in family photos, to being asked to take pictures instead of being in them, to existing in the corners of rooms instead of the center. Some kids push back when they feel unseen. I withdrew, melted quietly into the background, telling myself it was easier that way. Looking back, that childhood shaped everything. The emotional imbalance, the years of quiet dismissal, the constant message that I would always be less. Those things don't leave you. They settle into your bones. They teach you to expect the bare minimum from people, to apologize for taking up space, to believe that speaking up will only earn laughter or shame. And for a long time, I carried that into adulthood without realizing it. By the time I graduated high school, the difference between Camilla's path and mine was already mapped out as clearly as the highways dividing Lake Oswego from the rest of Portland. Camilla was destined for what my parents called a proper future, a private university, a shiny new car the day she turned 18, and a fully furnished apartment near campus, so she could focus on studying without stress. Meanwhile, I was gently but firmly encouraged to be realistic. That was my parents' polite way of saying, "Don't expect us to help you the way we help your sister," and so I didn't. I learned early that relying on them was like placing your weight on a cracked glass table. It looked solid enough, but the moment you leaned in, it shattered. Instead of heading off to some picturesque four-year university with a dorm room decorated by Pinterest boards, I enrolled at Portland Community College, working night shifts at a local coffee shop to cover tuition. My first apartment was a cramped, drafty studio on the east side of Portland, the kind where the heater rattled loudly in winter and the windows let in more cold air than they blocked. Still, it was mine. My space. A tiny sliver of independence carved out of necessity. No one from home ever visited. No one even asked for the address. Occasionally, my parents sent texts like, "Hope you're doing fine," or "Don't forget to be responsible," but they were short, detached messages. The kind you send to a distant acquaintance, not to your daughter starting her life alone. Holidays passed quietly. Birthdays too. I got used to heating canned soup at midnight after closing the cafe, studying until my eyes burned, and falling asleep at my desk because the mattress on the floor was too cold. Loneliness wasn't a shock, it was more like a familiar echo that followed me from childhood. Meanwhile, Camilla's life read like a curated Instagram feed. New clothes, new trips, new friends, new milestones. My parents proudly posted every one of her achievements: sorority events, weekend ski trips, her acceptance into a prestigious marketing program at a private university in California, complete with captions like, "So proud of our girl." I sometimes wondered if they realized they had two daughters, or if they cared. Still, even in the middle of those years when I felt small and invisible, there was one thing that kept me from collapsing under the weight of being underestimated. Art. The same art they dismissed, the sketches they once called weird, had grown into something bigger. Between classes and shifts, I practiced graphic design, teaching myself through YouTube tutorials and online forums. When my classmates complained about deadlines, I stayed up late creating passion projects to build a portfolio. At the cafe, while wiping counters or pulling shots of espresso, I watched customers walk in carrying laptops plastered with beautifully designed stickers and logos and thought, I want to make things like that. Things people carry with them. Then one day, a classmate saw my designs and said, "Hey, you should seriously start charging people." It sounded ridiculous at that moment. Charging? For what? For something my parents believed had no future? But he insisted and ended up becoming my first client. Then came another. And another. Before I knew it, I was designing logos, posters, and brand packages for small local businesses, juice bars, thrift stores, tattoo shops. It wasn't glamorous, and the payments were small, but every dollar I earned from design felt different from the ones I earned at the cafe. Coffee money paid bills. Design money fed my soul. I never told my parents about it. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I already knew how the conversation would go. Graphic design? Freelance? That's not a real career, Elena. Why don't you do something stable? You're wasting your time with hobbies. And the worst one, Camilla's working toward a real future. You should too. So, I stayed quiet. Silence was easier. Silence meant I didn't have to watch their faces tighten every time I talked about something I loved. But silence is a dangerous thing. It lets people write their own stories about you. My mother assumed my quiet meant I had nothing to show. My father assumed it meant failure, and Camilla? She assumed it meant she'd won. But the truth was, while they dismissed me, I was slowly, quietly building something of my own. After a year, my clients grew steadily, through word of mouth. A small bakery downtown referred me to a yoga studio. That studio referred me to a local photographer. That photographer referred me to a tech startup looking for brand identity work. By then, my nights were spent designing until sunrise, surrounded by coffee cups and half-finished sketches, and my days were a blur of emails and project deadlines. I was exhausted, stretched thin, barely balancing school and work, but I was alive in a way I had never been before. Eventually, I saved enough to rent a small desk at a coworking space, a place filled with freelancers, artists, coders, and dreamers who didn't fit into traditional paths either. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. No one looked at me like I was strange. No one compared me to a golden sister. They just saw the work. And they respected it. I started calling my freelance work a studio even though it was just a rented desk and a cracked screen laptop, because calling it that made me feel like it could one day become real. Parker Studio. I wrote at the top of my invoices. Parker Studio, on the portfolio website I built myself. Parker Studio, on the mock-up business cards I couldn't afford to print yet. I didn't know it then, but those early years of scraping by, juggling 2 jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, they were shaping something in me that my parents could never take credit for. Independence, resilience, and a level of self-belief I had to plant and water myself because no one else would. By the time I graduated with my associate degree, my design portfolio was stronger than most 4-year grads. Work flowed in steadily. I cut back my cafe hours. I stopped worrying about whether my parents were proud of me, because something in me was slowly starting to shift. And though I didn't tell them, though they had no idea what my life actually looked like, I felt for the first time like I was building a world where I finally mattered. A world where my voice didn't have to fight to be heard. No one at home knew who I was becoming. They didn't visit. They didn't ask. They didn't care. And honestly, that became my greatest advantage. Because sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being underestimated. And I had no idea then how useful that invisibility would become later at Thanksgiving when they looked at me like I was the same quiet, pathetic girl they remembered. They had no idea I wasn't living in the shadows anymore. They just hadn't seen the light yet. Despite everything I was building on my own, the clients, the late-night projects, the slow, steady growth of Parker Studio, my place in my family never changed. Every holiday continued to orbit around Camilla, as if she were the sun and the rest of us lived only to reflect her light. At Christmas, she chose the theme, the menu, the decorations. At Easter, she organized the brunch reservations and decided who sat where. At Thanksgiving, she dictated the dress code, the timing, even which dishes each person could bring. My parents always backed her, not because she earned that authority, but because she embodied the image they wanted to project: polished, presentable, perfect. Meanwhile, I was treated like the stray piece of furniture they couldn't throw away but didn't want guests to notice. Whenever an event approached, Mom would call Camilla to ask what she was wearing, whether she needed help with her hair or nails, what she wanted on the table. With me, there were no calls, no reminders, no invitations. Half the time, I found out gatherings happened only after seeing photos online: Camilla in a sparkly dress, my parents grinning beside her, the caption reading, "Family time." As if their family consisted of exactly 3 people and one unspoken absence. Eventually, I learned not to expect an invitation. Not because I didn't want one, God, I did, but because expecting anything from people who refuse to see you is a guaranteed way to break your own heart. But the moment that sealed it came a year before the Thanksgiving where everything would explode. It was early November, cold and raining the way Portland always is that time of year. I was leaving the co-working space when my phone buzzed. A text from Mom. I remember pausing under the awning, hopeful for the first time in a while, thinking maybe, just maybe, they were reaching out. But the message wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even neutral. It read, "This year the family wants everything to look perfect. Just stay home and rest, okay?" Translated into my mother's polite English tone, it meant, "We don't want you there to ruin things." My fingers went cold. I stared at the screen for a long moment, rain dripping from the hood of my jacket. When I finally replied, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. "Is something wrong? Why can't I come?" Her answer came almost instantly, like she had been waiting for me to ask. "You dress too casually. You speak awkwardly. You embarrass us." There it was, clean, sharp, unavoidable truth delivered in a few lines of text. If she'd slapped me, it would have hurt less. Because those weren't words said in a moment of anger. They were said casually, sent without hesitation, typed out with the kind of familiarity that comes from believing something for a very long time. I didn't argue. I didn't call. I didn't cry. I didn't send a long paragraph defending myself. I simply took a screenshot, my hands shaking just enough to blur the edges, and saved it in a folder on my phone. Not out of spite, not with the intention to one day use it as evidence, but because I needed a reminder. A reminder that I wasn't imagining things. That the distance between us wasn't my fault. That the reason I felt unwanted wasn't a story I invented in my head, it was one they continued to write for me. That night, I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, legs crossed, laptop still open from work, and I let the silence fill the room. A silence I had known since childhood. But this time was different. It didn't feel like the kind of silence that swallows you whole. It felt like a turning point. Like something inside me had finally, quietly broken free. I didn't plan a dramatic exit from the family or any grand statement. I didn't announce that I was done trying or tell them they'd hurt me. Instead, I simply stopped reaching out. I stopped texting first. I stopped waiting for calls that never came. I stopped pretending their approval was something I needed to breathe. I stopped trying to earn a seat at a table that was never set for me. In the months that followed, something strange happened. Life became lighter. I focused on work, on building connections with people who valued what I brought to the table. I took small freelance projects and bigger ones. I stayed late at the co-working space, sometimes until the cleaning crew arrived, but the exhaustion felt purposeful, not like the tiredness of constantly trying to impress people who looked right through me. My parents never noticed the shift. Not once did they text to ask how I was doing. Not once did they check whether I was spending the holidays alone. But Camilla? She posted photos of another perfect Thanksgiving, surrounded by friends, my parents beaming in the background, my absence not even acknowledged. That was the year I realized something fundamental. It is entirely possible to be part of a family and still feel completely alone. And loneliness born from neglect cuts deeper than loneliness born from solitude. Because solitude, at least, gives you space to grow. Neglect only gives you proof that some people will never choose you even if they're supposed to. But I didn't know then that their dismissal, those tiny cuts accumulated over years, was actually chiseling me into someone stronger. Someone sharper. Someone who would one day walk into their Thanksgiving dinner and smile at their cruelty because she finally knew who she had become without them. The year I quietly cut myself off from my family was the same year my life finally began to expand in ways I could never have predicted. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, like the way dawn creeps across a room before you even notice the sun has risen. One morning, I opened my inbox and saw an email that looked so polished I thought it was a scam. A tech company in Seattle, a mid-sized startup building productivity software, wanted to hire me to redesign their entire brand identity. They said they had seen my work on a yoga studio's Instagram page, followed the trail to other projects I'd done, and decided I was exactly the voice they wanted for their new direction. At first, I reread the email 3 times, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something more ordinary. But they didn't. It was real. And when I nervously sent my proposed quote, expecting them to negotiate it down to something humiliating, they replied within minutes, "Sounds good. When can you start?" The project paid more than 3 months of cafe shifts combined. More than my rent, more than any amount I'd ever seen attached to my name. I remember walking home from the co-working space that night in a kind of daze, Portland rain misting against my jacket, thinking, is this what it feels like to be seen? The startup loved my work. Their investors loved it too. And suddenly, my inbox wasn't a quiet corner of the internet anymore, it was buzzing. A wellness app reached out, then a boutique accounting firm, then a Washington-based e-commerce brand looking for packaging design. All referrals. All from people who had never met me but felt something in my work. It was strange, exhilarating, and painful all at once because strangers believed in me in ways my own family never had. As the months passed, I began to understand something important. Skill grows when people trust you with opportunity. And trust grows when people see your value. These new clients didn't care how quiet I was. They didn't care about the labels my family had given me. They cared about the work, the quality, the ideas, the clarity. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. Then came the email that changed everything. His name was Michael Grant, a branding veteran in his 60s who had built dozens of national campaigns across his career. He ran a small consulting firm in California but kept a house in Portland for the summers. Somehow, through the tangled web of Silicon Valley introductions, one of his partners had seen my Seattle rebrand and forwarded it to him. He invited me for coffee just to talk shop. I showed up terrified, expecting to be told everything I'd done wrong. But instead, he spent the entire meeting asking me questions, real questions about why I made certain design choices, where I saw myself going, what kind of brands I wanted to build someday. At the end, he said something no one in my life had ever said to me. "You have a voice, a strong one. And if you're willing, I'd like you on a project." The project? Branding a California investment fund preparing to launch a new venture wing. It was the biggest opportunity I had ever touched. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Working with Michael changed me. He treated me like an equal, respected my ideas, pushed me when I doubted myself. He introduced me to professional tools, workflows, and industry connections I never would have discovered on my own. Under his guidance, Parker's studio went from a small freelance side hustle to something real, something towering. I bought a new laptop, upgraded my software, and traded my rickety old desk at the co-working space for a corner table bathed in warm afternoon light. It felt like stepping into a new version of myself, one I had been growing toward without realizing. But through all of it, I didn't say a word to my family. Not because I wanted to hide my success, but because they had never asked. Not once. Not a text. Not a call. Not even a passing curiosity. My mother still assumed I was drifting through life with no direction. My father still believed I was finding myself, which was his polite way of saying he thought I was failing. Camilla, of course, bragged to everyone that she supported me financially, that I depended on her generosity, that she was the stable sister while I was the one who always struggled. And I let her. Because correcting her would require admitting I still cared how they saw me. So I stayed silent. Silence had always been easiest around them. But outside my family's shrinking orbit, the world was expanding. I began traveling Seattle for a client photoshoot, San Francisco for a design conference, Los Angeles for a consultation Michael arranged. Every trip was another layer of proof that I was becoming someone different from the invisible girl they raised. Someone sharper. Someone capable. Someone whose work mattered. And with every milestone, something grew inside me, not pride exactly, but a steady, grounding confidence that felt nothing like the fragile approval I used to chase from my parents. This confidence was internal, quiet but unshakable, built from late nights, messy drafts, revisions, failures, and breakthroughs no one saw but me. Still, a tiny part of me hoped even whether my family would ever ask. Whether they would ever look beyond the version of me they'd frozen in time, but they never did. And maybe that was the final piece. The understanding that my life was moving forward with or without them. That they had chosen not to know me. And I was finally choosing myself. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly predict, was that all of this growth, all of these quiet successes, were leading me straight into the storm waiting at the next Thanksgiving. The storm where my silence would break, not with anger, but with truth. The storm where the girl they ignored would walk back into their house not as a shadow, but as someone they could no longer pretend not to see. And all it would take to ignite that storm was a single question from Camilla's new boyfriend. A full year passed without a single call, text, or accidental "How are you?" from anyone in my family. I had wrapped myself in work, in independence, in the quiet satisfaction of no longer waiting for their approval. And then, just 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, my phone buzzed with a message in the family group chat, a chat I had muted months before. It was from my mother. "We're hosting Thanksgiving at home this year. We expect you to come. Just show up for the night." The wording made my stomach flip. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. A reminder that to them, I wasn't a person with feelings or boundaries. I was an accessory. A prop. Something they could place in a chair so the family picture looked complete. I stared at the message for hours. Part of me wanted to delete it, ignore it, pretend it never arrived. But another part, the part bruised by years of being pushed aside, wanted to see whether anything had changed. Whether absence had softened them. Whether life had taught them to look a little closer. I knew the answer even before I walked through their door, but hope is stubborn, and sometimes it lingers in the ruins long after everything else has collapsed. So I went. Not with excitement, not even with dread, but with a strange, steady calm. The kind that comes when you no longer expect anything. The moment I stepped into the house, that calm cracked. The living room was warm, lit by soft yellow bulbs, decorated with autumn leaves and candles. An aesthetic Camilla was famous for obsessively curating. But instead of welcoming me, the atmosphere tightened. Conversations died mid-sentence, heads turned. Camilla's friends, perched on the couch like glossy ornaments, gave me quick, appraising looks. My aunt nodded politely, but even she seemed surprised I was there. It felt like walking into someone else's family gathering, one I had accidentally crashed. Camilla appeared from the kitchen, cheeks flushed, hair styled perfectly as always, wearing a wool dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her eyes widened for a moment, just one split second of genuine shock before she masked it with the same performative delight she used on Instagram. "Elena, you made it," she chirped, as if she hadn't been the one telling people for years that I was too unstable, too lost, too messy to show up anywhere. She glided across the room and pulled along a tall, clean-cut guy with her. "This is Evan," she said proudly. He shook my hand with a warm grip, studying me with kind curiosity. "So, you're the little sister," he said, smiling. Camilla's told me a lot about you. Oh. My stomach tightened not because he said something wrong, but because I knew exactly what Camilla had told him. Stories curated to maintain her glittering image. Stories where I played the role of the underachieving sibling she graciously tolerated. Stories that made her feel bigger by making me smaller. Dinner began with the usual pleasantries: Camilla showing off new jewelry, Mom fussing over her boyfriend's plate, Dad listening to Evan talk about his job at a logistics company. I sat at the end of the table, the position I had occupied my entire life. Close enough to be present, far enough to be irrelevant. I wasn't surprised. I had expected this dynamic to resurface the moment I walked in. But what did surprise me was the way people kept glancing at me, subtle, sideways, as if waiting for something to happen. Even Evan looked at me more than once, like he was trying to reconcile the real me with whatever version of me Camilla had described. About halfway through dinner, when the turkey had been carved and the wine glasses refilled, Evan turned toward me with a warm, curious smile. "So, Elena," he asked, "what do you do for work?" It was a simple, normal question. One I had answered hundreds of times with clients, colleagues, designers, even strangers at networking events. I opened my mouth to speak, but my mother's voice sliced cleanly through mine. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't embarrass us." The air froze. Evan blinked, confused. And then, like a cue had been given, the entire table erupted into laughter. My father grinned at Camilla. My aunt covered her mouth to stifle a giggle. Even Camilla's friends chimed in, their eyes sparkling with the cruel amusement people feel when they think they've found an easy target. Camilla leaned in, resting her chin on her hand, smirk widening. "Come on, Elena," she said loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Just make something up this year. So you don't sound so pathetic. Last time you told someone you were a freelance designer, they thought you meant you made stickers in your bedroom." Another round of laughter burst out. No one asked if what she said was true. No one wondered whether it was hurtful. No one considered, even for a moment, that I might be sitting there absorbing every word. For a moment, the old version of me, the girl conditioned to shrink into silence, to pretend jokes didn't hurt, to swallow humiliation like medicine, almost resurfaced. Almost. But I didn't shrink. I didn't stammer. I didn't force a laugh to make them comfortable. I simply lifted my head and smiled. A small, quiet smile. Controlled, steady. The kind of smile that comes from someone who knows something the rest of the room doesn't. My mother's laughter faltered. Camilla's smirk twitched. Evan's eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity turning into something sharper. None of them knew that behind that smile was an entire world they'd never bothered to ask about. None of them knew what that one question from Evan was about to reveal. And none of them, least of all Camilla, had any idea that they were seconds away from watching the version of me they thought they knew crumble into dust. Because humiliation only works when the victim believes it. And I no longer did. For a moment, after the laughter settled, the dining room hummed with that smug, satisfied quiet people get when they think they've established a hierarchy, when they believe they've successfully pushed someone back into their assigned place. But I didn't move. I didn't look down. I didn't reach for my fork or pretend I hadn't heard them. Instead, I lifted my eyes slowly, deliberately, sweeping across the table. My voice, when it finally came, was astonishingly calm. "Why?" I asked softly. "Is everyone looking at me like I'm some kind of joke?" The question should have been harmless, almost innocent. But somehow it sliced through the room with a sharpness none of them expected. My mother stiffened. My aunt stared at her plate. A few of Camilla's friends shifted uneasily. And then my father, who had barely looked at me since I arrived, cleared his throat and spoke with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Well," he began, "Camilla told Evan you've never really done anything with your life." He gestured vaguely, as if waving at my entire existence. "And your mother might have mentioned you rely on state assistance to get by. So," he shrugged, "people make assumptions." Assumptions. The word landed like a dull hammer against my ribs. They weren't assumptions. They were lies. Old lies. Convenient lies. Lies shaped carefully to maintain the narrative they preferred Camilla as the successful daughter, me as the pitiful one. I let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, quiet, restrained, but edged with something that made the back of the table straighten. My smile wasn't wide, but it was precise, deliberate, controlled. And it chilled the room in a way no raised voice ever could. Even Evan's expression shifted as he looked at me, not confused or amused anymore, but attentive. Alert. Camilla blinked at me, her confidence faltering. What? She snapped, but it came out thinner than she intended. You're not getting upset, are you? As if upset was some shameful behavior reserved for people at the bottom of the family ladder. As if she expected me to shrink back into my seat and pretend nothing hurt. But I didn't. Something in me, something I had spent years building alone, rose above the sting of their words. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape against the hardwood floor. The entire table went silent, the way a forest goes silent when it senses a storm approaching. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't deliver a dramatic speech. I simply said, with polite composure, "Excuse me for a moment. I need to make a call." My mother frowned, instantly suspicious. To who? But I didn't answer. I turned and walked toward the living room, each step steady and unhurried. They watched me leave like they weren't sure whether to be amused or nervous. Evan's eyes followed me longest. Once I reached the far side of the house, out of sight but close enough to hear the faint murmurs behind me, I pulled out my phone. My hands weren't shaking. My breathing didn't falter. It felt strange, almost like an out-of-body moment, like I had finally stepped into the version of myself I had been preparing to become. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang once. Twice. Then a warm, familiar voice answered, "Elena?" I didn't explain. I didn't give context. I didn't need to. I simply said the one sentence that would change the rest of the night. "Can you send the documents now? I need them here. Immediately." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Of course. Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That was all. I ended the call and looked at my reflection in the darkened window, my expression calm, almost serene. The kind of calm that comes when you finally stop running from who you are. Behind me, laughter picked up again, not as loud as before, but strained, uncertain. They didn't know what to make of my reaction. Camilla's voice rose slightly, giggling too loudly, trying too hard. "She's being dramatic," she said, her tone wavering. "She always does this. She'll come back and pretend nothing happened." But she didn't sound convinced. Not this time. I walked back toward the dining room and stopped in the doorway, hands loosely at my sides. No one spoke. No one knew what to expect from me anymore. And for the first time in my life, that worked in my favor. I sat down as quietly as I had stood up. No speech, no warning. Just silence, steady, heavy, charged. A silence that didn't come from fear. A silence that came from power. Because deep down, they could feel it too. Something had shifted. Something irreversible. Something they could no longer laugh away. And in a matter of minutes, when the doorbell rang, when the documents arrived, every one of them would understand exactly what that shift meant. I had barely returned to my seat when the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the faint, uneasy tension of people sensing a change they couldn't name yet. Forks clinked softly against plates. Someone cleared their throat. Camilla laughed too loudly at something no one said. My mother fussed with the napkins as if straightening linen could straighten the atmosphere. They were all waiting for me to break, waiting for me to fold into the small, quiet version of myself they were accustomed to controlling. But I didn't speak. I didn't apologize. I simply sat there, calm, composed, unbothered, and that, more than anything, unsettled them. 10 minutes passed in a slow, stretched silence. 10 minutes that felt like a countdown only I knew was happening. And then right on cue the doorbell rang. A sharp, crisp chime that sliced through the dining room like a blade. Every head lifted. Camilla paused mid-sentence. Even my father's fork hovered in the air. My mother frowned, confused. Is someone else coming? No, Dad said, glancing toward the hallway. But I knew. I knew exactly what, or rather, who was at the door. I stood up calmly and walked toward the entryway, my footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood. When I opened the door, a courier in a winter jacket held out a thick, sealed envelope. "Delivery for Elena Parker," he said, checking the name on his handheld device. I signed, thanked him, and closed the door behind me. When I turned around, nearly every person at the table was craning their neck to see what I was holding. "What's that?" Camilla asked, eyebrows raised with a performative curiosity. "A delivery," I answered simply, walking back to the table. I set the envelope down at the center of the table. My name, Elena Parker, was printed on the front in bold black type. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that thickens the air. Forks lowered. Conversations died. Even the heating vent seemed to hush itself. I could feel all their eyes on me, wide, watchful, waiting. Camilla's boyfriend, Evan, leaned back in his chair, studying me as if finally realizing he'd been given an incomplete version of who I was. Camilla, meanwhile, looked irritated, as if my opening an envelope was some kind of attention-stealing stunt. I slid my finger under the seal and opened it cleanly. Inside was a stack of documents neatly clipped, professionally printed, unmistakably important. I placed them on the table and spread them out, one by one, like laying cards in a game they didn't know they were playing. The first page was the contract. A multi-page agreement from the Seattle tech company, the full branding redesign project with my name signed at the bottom. The amount printed at the top of the invoice section. $280,000. Not theoretical, not projected, already paid. The second page. A legal document confirming me as a 20% co-founder of a fast-growing startup currently in seed funding negotiations, something Michael had encouraged me to join after seeing my skills. The third. An email from the California Investment Fund addressed directly to me, congratulating me on my branding strategy for their portfolio company and noting, in bold text, that the design direction I created helped them raise $8 million in capital within 2 weeks. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The room was frozen, every face stiff, every breath held. Camilla's laughter died instantly. My mother's hand stopped midair, still gripping her wine glass. My father's jaw slackened, the first visible crack in his stoic mask. And then finally someone spoke. "Camilla. What is this?" She whispered, her face draining of color. What are you doing with all of this?" I looked at her gently, almost kindly. The same way someone might look at a child who doesn't understand the rules of a game they thought they'd already won. "This?" I said, tapping the documents lightly. "This is my work. IIT. Evan leaned forward now, elbows on the table, eyes locked on me. "You did all this?" he asked, voice low with genuine awe. I nodded. "Yes." My mother snapped out of her trance long enough to force a shaky laugh. "Elena, stop. What kind of nonsense are you bringing here?" But her voice trembled. Because this was not nonsense. This was real, printed, signed, validated, delivered. I turned to her, still calm. "Mom," I said, "this is the job you told me not to mention. The one you said would make the family look bad. The one you called pathetic." Her face went pale. My father swallowed hard. Camilla's mouth hung open in a tiny O of shock. I gathered the pages and tapped them neatly into a stack. "It's funny," I added softly, "considering it pays better than everyone else at this table combined." A few people flinched, but no one laughed this time. Camilla shook her head, stammering. No, this doesn't make sense. You're not the successful one." "I am. I've always." Her voice broke. She sounded like she was arguing with reality. My mother finally found words, whispered like a confession. "You never told us." I met her eyes, steady. You never asked. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was awakening. A reckoning. A shift that cracked open the foundation of every lie they had built about me. And as I slid the documents back into their envelope, one calmer, sharper truth settled over the table like cold air. They didn't actually know who I was. They never had. For a long moment, no one said a word. The documents lay on the table like an exposed vein, pulsing with a truth none of them had expected. The room felt different now, heavier, quieter, as if the air itself had paused. My mother looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't. My father looked angry but didn't know where to aim it. And Camilla looked like someone slowly realizing the ground beneath her heels was collapsing. But the person who broke the silence wasn't me. It was Evan. He leaned forward, eyes locked on Camilla, his voice steady and disturbingly calm. "Camilla," he said, "you told me that you've been financially supporting your sister. That you pay her rent. That she wouldn't survive without your help." And Striper. Color drained from Camilla's face like water spilling down a drain. Her jaw twitched once, twice, and then froze. I didn't say it like that," she stammered. Just maybe you misunderstood." My father turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "You said that? To your boyfriend?" His tone wasn't protective, it was stunned, embarrassed. Camilla lifted her chin, trying desperately to regain the confidence she had wrapped herself in every day of her life. "I was just trying to explain the situation," she insisted. "Elena has always been." But I cut her off gently, not cruelly, just truthfully. "Chaotic? Lost? Unemployed?" I tilted my head, smiling with a softness that made her flinch. "That's what you told him, right? You said I was begging you for money because I couldn't take care of myself." No one breathed. Camilla opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "So," I continued calmly, "to make yourself look like a savior, you told people I couldn't pay my own rent. That I lived off your generosity. That I was a burden you carried." Her lips trembled. I didn't mean." Evan turned to her, and this time he didn't bother hiding the disgust tightening his jaw. "If that's true," he said, voice sharp, "then explain something to me." He reached into the pocket of his blazer and pulled out his phone, unlocking it with a single swipe. He tapped the screen a few times, then spun it around for her to see. "Explain," he said coldly, "why there's a $6,200 charge on my credit card for the sofa you bought last month." The room snapped into stillness. My mother's gasp was sharp enough to cut glass. My father straightened in his chair. And Camilla, my beautiful, perfect, adored sister, went pale from her hairline to her collarbone. I can explain," she whispered. But the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Evan didn't blink. "Explain why you told me your family was struggling financially, that you were covering Elena's expenses, that you needed to buy a new sofa because your sister kept ruining the old one." My mother looked horrified. "You said what?" "I was going to pay it back." Camilla cried, her voice cracking like paint under heat. I just things got tight, and No," Evan interrupted. His tone wasn't raised, but it hit harder than a shout. "You weren't going to pay it back. You were never planning to. You lied. You lied about being broke. You lied about supporting your sister. You lied about—" "Stop," Camilla shrieked, pushing her chair back. "Just stop." But Evan didn't. He stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket as if preparing to leave. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said quietly. "I actually thought your family was struggling. I thought you were the only one stepping up. I felt sorry for you." He glanced at me, and his eyes softened just slightly. "But now I see it clearly. You weren't supporting anyone, you were using me." Camilla's breath hitched. "Evan, please." He raised one hand, stopping her. "And honestly," he said, his voice deepening with finality, "the only person in this entire house who seems to have any integrity is Elena." The sentence slammed into the dining room like a physical blow. My mother flinched. My father looked away. Camilla's knees buckled, and she caught herself on the table's edge. "Don't do this," she begged. "Not here, not in front of them." "In front of who?" Evan snapped. "Your audience?" He gestured around the table. "Because that's all this is to you, a stage." My mother, desperate to regain control of the narrative, suddenly found her voice. "Evan, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "don't let Elena twist this. She's always been jealous." I turned toward her, still calm. "Mom," I said softly, "I didn't twist anything. I didn't even say anything." I lifted the envelope slightly with my fingertips. All I did was open a package. Then I looked directly at Camilla, who was shaking now, not from fear but from rage and humiliation. "You," I said gently, "did the rest." My mother's face turned red as she slammed her hand on the table. "How dare you let an outsider talk down to your sister like that?" she snapped. "How dare you sit there and let her be humiliated?" "One." I turned to her, my voice level, almost compassionate. "Mom," I said, "I didn't humiliate her. She built the pedestal. She told the lies. She climbed onto it herself. And she's the one who fell off." The silence that followed was total, suffocating, inescapable. For the first time in my entire life, every person in that house was forced to see the truth. Not the version they'd curated. Not the narrative Camilla controlled. But reality. And it shattered the image they'd spent years polishing. Evan didn't wait for dessert. He didn't wait for anyone to calm down or for Camilla to recover enough composure to spin a new version of events. As soon as the weight of his words settled over the table like a storm cloud, he stepped back from his chair, straightened his jacket, and said quietly, "I'm done." 1. Camilla reached out instinctively, as if grabbing his wrist would rewind the last 10 minutes. Erase the lies, erase the humiliation, but he stepped away before her fingers even brushed his sleeve. She froze there, hands suspended in the air, looking more shocked than heartbroken, as if she couldn't fathom the idea that someone, anyone, would walk away from her. She had always been the one doing the leaving, the dismissing, the choosing. She had never been the one left behind. "Evan, please," she whispered, voice cracking. But he didn't even look back. The front door opened, then closed, and the sound echoed through the house like a final verdict. What followed was worse than the shouting that usually filled the Parker home when something went wrong. It was silence, raw, stunned, disbelieving. Camilla's face crumpled, and without a word she fled upstairs. A door slammed. A lock clicked. Then came the muffled sound of her crying. My parents sat at the table as if glued in place, their expressions twisted in a mix of shock, anger, and something else I had never seen in them before. Fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of losing control. Fear of the image collapsing. They looked at each other, then at the documents I had placed earlier, and then finally at me as if searching for a target, a scapegoat, someone to blame. My father was the first to speak. "Elena," he said sharply, "what you did tonight was unnecessary." "All? What I did?" I repeated quietly. My mother chimed in, her voice rising with desperation. "You humiliated your sister. You blindsided her in front of her boyfriend and made us look ridiculous." I let out a slow breath. "All I did was open an envelope." "You knew what you were doing," my father snapped. "Did I?" I asked softly. "Because from where I'm sitting, Camilla is the one who lied, the one who used someone else's credit card, the one who painted me as a charity case so she could look like a hero." They said nothing. Not because they agreed, but because they had no rebuttal. No excuse. No angle they could twist. And so, in true Parker fashion, they defaulted to the only response they understood: blame me anyway. "Your sister is hurting," Mom hissed. "She brought it on herself," I replied. The temperature in the room dropped. My mother's lips tightened. My father pushed back from the table, pacing like a man searching for an argument strong enough to revive a collapsing narrative. But there wasn't one. Not tonight. The facade had cracked too deeply. The image they cared about more than their own daughters was slipping through their fingers. And for once, it wasn't my fault and they knew it. As I stood to leave, my mother tried one last attempt at control. "Don't go," she snapped. "You need to fix what you caused." Die. I stopped at the edge of the dining room, turning just enough to meet her eyes. "I didn't cause this," I said quietly. "You did by choosing lies over truth and image over integrity." She opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. There was nothing left to say. I walked out of the Parker house that night feeling more free than sad. Not because the fallout didn't matter, but because, for the first time, the truth was louder than their voices. But fallout has a way of spreading. And the Parker family collapse was only beginning. A week later, I was in my co-working space, sipping lukewarm coffee while editing a proposal, when my phone buzzed with a message from a friend who worked in HR at the same company as Camilla. "Did you hear? Camilla got fired." My fingers hovered above the keyboard. Why? Misuse of company funds. Corporate card charges flagged. Someone traced spending leaks back to her. It wasn't small stuff. Oh, $6,200 for a sofa was apparently just the beginning. Maybe I should have felt something. Shock, sympathy, anger. But all I felt was a strange, quiet resignation. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't karma catching up dramatically. This was simply truth doing what truth always does. Eventually, it surfaces. Later that afternoon, another message arrived, this time from an unknown number. Mom. Then Dad. Then Mom again. Calls. Missed calls. Voicemails. More calls. I didn't listen. I didn't answer. Because I finally realized something life-changing. Every time I picked up the phone before, it was out of hope they would apologize, hope they would finally see me, hope they would treat me like family. But hope can be a prison. And I had broken out. So I let the phone ring, and ring, and ring, until eventually, it stopped. In the days after Thanksgiving, after the calls stopped and the dust settled, life in Portland moved gently forward. The rain returned, steady and familiar, washing the last traces of autumn off the sidewalks. I threw myself into work not to distract myself, but because it finally felt like home. Parker Studio didn't just grow, it blossomed. Projects multiplied. Referrals poured in. The co-working space I once treated like a borrowed refuge suddenly felt too small for everything happening in my career. Clients wanted meetings. Teams wanted strategy sessions. Investors wanted consultations. One morning, while reviewing drafts for a startup's holiday campaign, I received an email I read 3 times before it sank in. An invitation to speak at a major West Coast design conference. Me. The girl my family once dismissed as awkward, unfocused, embarrassing. When I stepped onto that stage, weeks later surrounded by lights, microphones, and hundreds of attendees in the audience, I didn't think about my family. I thought about the 18-year-old version of myself, hunched in a freezing studio apartment, sketching in the dark with numb fingers and stubborn hope. I thought about the girl who kept going even when no one believed in her. And as I spoke about visual identity, brand storytelling, and building design careers without traditional privilege, I felt something I'd never felt before. Complete, unfiltered pride. With the money I'd saved from my projects, I finally did something I once thought impossible. I bought a small house near Forest Park, tucked among tall evergreens and soft moss-covered trails. A quiet place. A place with sunlight through the windows and enough space for a real studio. A place my family once insisted I would never afford. I carried the keys into my new living room one crisp December morning, set my bags down, and stood in the empty stillness. No voices telling me I was careless. No eyes watching for mistakes. No expectations. Just peace, soft and simple and entirely mine. In that quiet, my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Dad. Then another from Mom. "Come home for Christmas. We need to talk." The words hung in the air like a familiar echo, one I no longer owed my heart to. I stared at the screen, not with anger, but with a strange tenderness. They hadn't apologized. They hadn't acknowledged anything. They simply wanted the version of me they could control, the me who stayed small so their world felt big. I set the phone down and let out a gentle breath. No resentment. No longing. Just clarity. Family, I whispered to myself, never makes you beg for respect. And for the first time, I didn't go. I didn't pack a bag, rehearse explanations, or brace myself for disappointment. Instead, I made a different plan. A plan that felt more like Christmas than anything the Parker household had offered me in years. On Christmas Eve, with Portland draped in soft winter fog, I turned my little Forest Park house into something warm enough to melt even the coldest December night. String lights wove around the banister. Cinnamon simmered on the stove. I filled the living room with blankets and pillows, lit candles on every surface, and wrapped small gifts with careful folds. But it wasn't for a picture-perfect family gathering. It was for people who actually needed warmth. Through a local shelter I'd volunteered with years ago, I organized a small Christmas event for women and teens experiencing homelessness, people whose families had abandoned them too, in quieter, harsher ways. I bought them coats, gloves, journals, art supplies, gift cards. I ordered catering from a local restaurant, filled the house with food, and opened my door to strangers who deserved to feel seen. The living room filled with laughter, soft tears, stories of hardship and survival. A young girl showed me her sketchbook, raw, emotional drawings that reminded me painfully of my younger self. I knelt beside her, handed her a new set of pencils, and whispered, "Your art matters. Keep going. The world needs your voice." Zero. She threw her arms around me, and in that moment, surrounded by people who knew the ache of being unseen, I felt more at home than I ever had in my parents' house. The night glowed with something real. Not perfection. Not image. Not performance. But humanity. Warm, imperfect, healing humanity. When the last guest left, when the candles were blown out, when the soft quiet returned, I knew I had built something my family never gave me. A life rooted in compassion, purpose, and self-respect. Later that night, I finally picked up my phone. There were more messages from my parents. A few long, emotional ones. A few angry ones. None of them said the one thing I needed: "We're sorry." So I didn't respond. Not out of spite. But because I had outgrown chasing love from people who didn't know how to give it. I stepped outside with a cup of tea, the cold air crisp against my cheeks, the forest quiet under a thin veil of winter. Above me, the sky shimmered faintly with stars. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole. No longer the shadow beside Camilla. No longer the joke at the Thanksgiving table. No longer the family embarrassment. Just Elena Parker. Artist. Founder. Homeowner. Human. Enough. More than enough. If you've ever been overlooked by your own family, treated as less than, or told you weren't enough, remember this. Your value is not defined by who fails to see it. It is defined by who you choose to become. And you are allowed to walk away to protect your peace. Before you leave, tell me in the comments, what state of the U.S. are you watching from? Or what country? I'd love to know how far this story traveled, and I want you to know that wherever you are, you're not alone.